Here we are in Chapter 5, Part 2. For this part of the chapter, I'm going to change things up a little bit as far as the way that I do them. I usually go through and cover pretty much everything in the chapter. But this is a very long chapter, and this would make for a very long video. So in the meantime, while we're talking about this stuff, I want you to also be reading the textbook. Make sure you read this chapter. There's so much more to it than what we're actually going to cover within this video. We're going to start this part with a little bit of talking about body messages, what we do with our bodies when we speak. So as you see, there's just a whole list of different body gestures. Kinesics is what it's called, and different messages that they convey. So we have what are called emblems, the study of communicating through body movements. Well, excuse me, that's kinesics. Definition of emblems is a substitute for words such as okay or peace. We have hand gestures for those. So in our culture, the thumb and the forefinger is an okay symbol, two fingers, index and middle finger in the air, that's peace. And we have other gestures that stand for other words. And then you can get into actual sign language. Just as an aside here, sign language is verbal communication. So even though it's non-vocal, do remember sign language is still language, so it is a verbal communication form. But back to what's here on this slide. Illustrators. Illustrators accompany and literally illustrate a verbal message. So if I say no, I'll shake my head from side to side. If I say yes, I'll nod my head. If I say hello, I may wave my hand back and forth. So they will accompany to illustrate the visual or the verbal message. Then affect displays are expressions that convey emotion. That's what affect means here. Regulators are natural responses to conversation. So it's nods, facial expressions in response. It's things like, sure, go on. Those expressions that don't have much in the way of linguistic value, but they continue the conversation on. Then we have what are called adapters. Adapters satisfy some need and are usually unintentional. Self-adapters, alter adapters, and object adapters. I want you to look at this within the text for further information. Another thing to remember about nonverbals in general, but definitely about these, is that they will vary from culture to culture. So different facial expressions will mean different things in a different culture. Amount of eye contact, certain gestures. So it's good to study up on especially gestures if you're going to travel abroad. And finally on this slide, we have the concept of body appearance and the messages that are sent there. Consider things like personal hygiene and grooming, the way we dress, tattoos or piercings. Those are all going to send certain messages to an audience. We have facial communication specifically. Your face says a lot. I've said this before. Facial expressions, facial communication. We have the smile, of course. They say the smile is a universal hello, which is incorrect, by the way. But we have the Duchenne smile, which is a real or genuine smile. And then, of course, you can fake a smile as well. We need to learn how to manage our facial expressions. If we're trying to get an idea across, we may need to intensify, or if we feel we're coming across too strong, we may need to de-intensify. So look closer at these concepts as well. facial feedback hypothesis is basically that your facial expressions impact how you feel and what you perceive from others. So if you're going through life with a frown on your face, you'll likely be able to pick up on other people who are also in that same state, who are also sad. You'll be able to read that. Sometimes you'll read it even when it's not there. Again, these facial expressions will also vary by culture. Eye communication also varies from culture to culture, though it's not on this slide. Don't worry, we'll get there. Eye contact helps us to monitor feedback. So take the context of a public speaker. A public speaker should be engaging with the audience, scanning their faces, making eye contact with anyone who will look at them. And so as you scan around, you're watching body language, you're watching direct eye contact from the audience, and so on to gather feedback. We do the same thing in interpersonal communication. You can also use eye contact to secure attention, to get someone's attention to look at us. If they offer any eye contact at all, usually that's a good way to draw someone in. To regulate a conversation, to show who's in charge of that conversation and when it's whose turn to speak. To signal the nature of a relationship is another thing that we can do. Pardon me. To signal status. It's just always kind of made me think of moms. Moms are great at giving the look. When you're a little kid and you're doing something that maybe you shouldn't be doing, and you see that your mother is looking at you from across the room, and you know from that look on her face that you should stop. It also rolls right into the last thing on this slide about compensating for physical distance. Sometimes we talk to someone from across the room, and we are able to make that connection by and large because of eye contact. We will actually use more eye contact to talk to that person if they are further away than if we were only a couple of feet away from each other. There is the concept of eye avoidance as well. Eye avoidance is where we might avert our eye contact from people that we might otherwise interact with. So if you're in public and you see a mother disciplining her child, you would probably, most likely, avert your eye contact. This is a way to give privacy in a public space. Civil inattention. Intending to look away because it's not appropriate for me to be a part of that somewhat private moment. Here we are again talking about pupil dilation. I mentioned this in the first video this week. Our pupils change depending on our emotional state. Revealing interest, emotional arousal. If you're fearful, your eyes will do one thing. If you're excited, they'll do another. And so your pupil dilation actually says a lot about your emotional state. Again, one must be kind of trained to look for those things, though there is an instinctual level, but to actually understand what's going on with someone takes a bit more training. We have communication through touch. Nonverbal, remember, that's what we're talking about here. Touch can mean a variety of different things. It can convey emotions. It can indicate a certain level of playfulness. If you're joking with someone, you may clap them on the shoulder to indicate that you're joking where otherwise they might have taken you seriously. There's a certain level of control that we can communicate through touch. Ritual. Even a ritual like a greeting is conveyed through touch. And of course, there's task-related touching as well, to communicate directions or Uh, Sometimes you have to touch other people to conduct your job. Touch avoidance is what it sounds like. It's where you avoid physical contact with other people, whether that's handshakes, hugging, touching people on the arm or the shoulder while you speak to them. And when we avoid touch, or if we are high touch avoidance type people, we are probably also high communication apprehension. So we fear communication, at least on some level. We are also far less likely to disclose personal information if we are high in touch avoidance. Then we have what's called paralanguage. Paralanguage is a concept that may be a bit obscure, at least by term, but just remember, this is the voice, the vocal but nonverbal dimension of speech. So if you've ever gotten in trouble not for what you said, but how you said it, then you got in trouble because of your use of paralanguage. This top bullet, you see several different terms: stress, rate, volume, vocalizations, and pitch. I've always used the expression instead of stress, something called intonation, but it's the emphasis on certain words during a statement. There's an example of this in your text. Rate has to do with how quickly someone speaks or how slowly. Volume is what it sounds like, the relative loudness of a speaker. Vocalizations are going to be things like audible pauses or acknowledgments. And then pitch has to do with the range of sounds that your voice makes from high to low. It's also known as tone. Paralanguage has an effect on the perceptions that people have of you and the way you perceive other people. So when you hear a certain tone of voice or way of speaking, that helps you form your opinion of who that person is. Sometimes someone sounds big and tough by the tone of their voice. And so you attribute those characteristics to the person. Other times just the opposite. Some people sound very aggressive or very docile. But then an interesting fact that socioeconomic status can actually be predicted by paralanguage in many studies. How quickly we speak is also tied to persuasiveness. Studies indicate that in American culture, at the very least, the faster someone speaks, the more persuasive they are. Of course, there is a break point, but generally we speak at 120 to 140 words a minute. If we up that to 180, 200, 220 words a minute, we are actually perceived as more persuasive. We're more likely to be able to talk someone into something when we speak more quickly. It seems to be an odd phenomenon, but one that's been verified. The way we use silence also varies. Silence, and this makes sense, is a nonverbal factor to communication. Of course, if we're talking to someone, if we pause in silence, it gives us time to think. Or if we pause in a conversation, we may be giving someone else time to think. We can also use silence to hurt others just by a lack of response. We can use it as an opportunity to reflect, to calm ourselves down, responding to personal anxieties. We can use it as a method of preventing communication, so just cutting off all communication by simply not engaging, not speaking to someone else. Sometimes to communicate emotion or achieve specific effects. If you want to gather people's attention, this is more impactful in public speaking. If you want to bring eyes back to you, to bring ears back to you, a lot of times you are going to pause. because a break in the sound of your voice will oftentimes grab people's attention. There's a theory of this, it's called spiral of silence theory. I want you to find that and look at that in the text. And then, of course, the use of silence and the value of silence is determined by culture. And there's this whole section on what's called proxemics. Spatial messages and territoriality. It's a difficult word to say. Territoriality. Proxemics is how distances between people impact communication. So I've left these here: intimate, personal, social, and public spacing. And there are differences in how close we let people get to us. And today, it's different than when this book was written. So you can keep that in mind. That there are only certain people we allow to get within a foot of us, or even 2 feet maybe. Intimate space. And then personal space is a little further out. Social is a little further out. And the people we don't know at all that we're interacting with publicly, they're even further out. Again, today there are a few exceptions, and I believe that the COVID-19 pandemic, which I very rarely mention in my lectures, I believe that it has changed forever proxemic distances and what they will indicate. I combine these two concepts because they are obscure, to say the least. Artifactual communication and olfactory communication. Artifactual communication consists of messages conveyed by objects that are made by human hands, the things that we choose to surround ourselves with. What your office space looks like, what your bedroom looks like, what your living room looks like, what you choose to adorn your walls with, or what you choose to adorn yourself with. Jewelry, clothing choices, piercings, the like. Those all communicate different things. And then olfactory communication is about communication through smell. So we wear perfume, we wear colognes in order to send a certain message. We want to brush our teeth so our breath smells minty if you're trying to impress a date. Both of these concepts are really concerned with making an impression of either an environment and the people in it, or just people. So you want your house to smell warm and inviting, and so maybe you have a wax melter that you put some wax that smells like some kind of a cake or something like that. It's warm, it's inviting. And so that's an olfactory communication thing. It's nonverbal. There's no words attached. These are kind of obscure concepts. And then finally here, in this section of our lecture, we talk about temporal communication. Things that have to do with time. Interpersonal time, you want to consider punctuality. In our monochronic culture, being punctual is considered the right thing to do. To be late is considered wrong. It's considered rude, incivil. And you can see all these different things. The amount of time we spend working versus talking to other people. The amount of time you keep someone on the phone. How much time you spend devoted to personal relationships versus working relationship. These are all interpersonal and nonverbal communication. Because especially in the monochronic culture that we are, the way we use time sends messages to others. So learn how to use time effectively and efficiently, especially in personal relationships and your work environment. It says a lot about you.